Okay, thank you and welcome everybody to tonight's meeting of City of York Council's Audit and Governance Committee. My name is Councillor Hollier. I'll be chairing the committee this evening. We've got members and independent people joining us on either side, and we've got Ben Roberts, who's Council Officer, and Louise Cook, who's a Democracy Officer as well. Just joining us, making sure we're kept in line. Can I ask if any members have any declarations of interest? No? I think we've got one substitution, which is Councillor Vassie substituting for Councillor Mason. So welcome this evening. Move on then to the action log. Obviously, the minutes of the last meeting aren't available yet because the agenda for this meeting was published at the same time we were having that meeting. And I understand many of the changes we made to the action log, obviously this was published before we made those changes. So take this with a slight pinch of salt. But are there any issues or comments anybody would like to make? Councillor Rose?
Just that the archived actions is now an extremely long list, and if we can cull everything up to the current meeting that has already been completed in the past and agreed, it will make it a lot easier to read going forward into future meetings.
Okay, yeah. I say it's quite a lot of pages of things we've done.
Chair, could I just compliment you all, which is not something I spend a lot of time doing, but 2 years ago, there was no action log process. There was no control document which you were bringing forward and using to monitor where you were going. And slowly over time, it's got better. And at the last meeting, people were saying action log number X, action log number Y. Your attention was being directed to following that process through, and you were doing it. And officers were writing to you before the meeting saying, here is the response to action log item number so-and-so. So you're beginning to get together there a control mechanism, which means you can get through the minutes more quickly because you're focusing on that action log, and that's where your attention can be maintained. And you have used it quite well recently, and you didn't even have it 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments? If we can move on then to public participation. We've got two members of the public speaking this evening. I've got a bit of blurb to read out first, so I'll just do that. So we now come to the public participation item on the agenda. Before we start, can I remind our participants that in making their comments, they must not say anything which is defamatory or discriminatory, make any personal attack on an officer and or member, or disclose confidential information or exempt information, including personal information. So you've been told. If we could first then have Charles Malarkey, who's speaking from the Salvation Army. Let's join us at the front. Obviously, you've got 3 minutes to address the committee. Shall I give you a warning about 30 seconds to go?
Right, thank you, Chair. Just coming down to represent Salvation Army, just to say that we're happy that there's been a new report, and there is to be a consultation area homeless strategy with the community sector. And I'll be very, very happy to be feeding back into that with the clients that I've worked with. And just to say that we're very much still here. We're doing a drop-in. We've got fitness classes going. And they've gone through the roof. We've had a refurb on the nat pad. And hopefully that will be going out to shortly. So just to say that we were happy with it, there's been an update on the report.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right.
Okay, we could hear then from Gwen Swinburne.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I note the unbelievable delays in producing this slim picking Salvation Army report. Multiple background papers required by law are absent. These include the scrutiny report, the origin of this report, scrutiny minutes, the contract, the waiver record, the deed of variation, even the last effort to this committee withdrawn by the Director of Governance because of so many inaccuracies. Another report with no active links also. You are not told why an executive member confident the contract extension was unlawful when it's magically lawful now. What makes matters worse is this report tells us much less than has already been published, nor indeed does it tell us what proposals are in place for you to consider to improve matters going forward. Let's see what we did learn today. The end of the contract was regrettably not managed well, but no explanation. Issues identified, but not shared here, were the result of unexplained, unforeseen circumstances and unexplained technical disruption. We learn also that too little attention was paid within the contract wording, whatever that is supposed to mean. We learn of an unexplained internal matter related to SA staffing, a legal remedy invested in but not pursued, inferring SA failed in their duties. Silence also on the alleged staffer conflict of interest. We learn, I am horrified to read, no strategic relationship management meetings were held throughout the term of the contract. Almost unbelievable. What were the contract management meeting protocols in the contract? It appears none. How far does this reach across other contracts and other departments? Let's be honest, this report appears the culmination and a deliberate insult, in my view, to delay and obfuscate and to confound the stated wishes of members. Clearly, an independent report should have been and should yet be commissioned. We finally see from this obfuscation 3 one-line recommendations. One reached the AGS as a serious governance matter with 0 explanation or plan. Chair, to move forward, can you commission not Verital but RSM to undertake an internal audit on contract management, procurement planning, forward procurement procedures and transparency? A truly independent auditor is needed to finally address this cover-up so you get the report and plan we all deserve. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if I could invite to join us Pauline Stutchfield and Francis Harrison. Pauline is Director of Housing and Communities and Francis the Head of Legal Services and Deputy Monitoring Officer. Thank you.
So if I can, members, in advance of consideration of the item and before Pauline and Francis start off, it's perhaps helpful for me to ensure that members are clear about the purpose of the report and the committee's role in considering the matter. So the report is intended to address the factual questions of how the Salvation Army contract came to an end, the process that was followed in that, and what lessons can be learned from that process. This is entirely right, as befits a technical and process committee of the council. The report is not intended to deal with any of the personalities involved in the process, nor would it be appropriate for them to do so, as there are separate processes within the council, either through the code of conduct or through a disciplinary procedure if that was required in any given case. Equally, the report is not intended to try and apportion blame for any action, since that would be inappropriate in a public meeting, particularly where officers do not have the ability to reply, and that could give rise to claims against the council. I hope that's a helpful little summary, and I'll now hand you across to Pauline.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just to explain my role, I'm currently newly appointed Director of Housing and Communities, and Francis and I, Francis, Head of Legal Services, were asked to undertake this review independently of the service at the time earlier this year. But as I've explained, I am now Director of Housing and Communities, so I will be taking forward any learning from this review. Previously, I was the Director of Customer and Communities and had no line management of housing services at all. So I was at that point, at the early point, completely independent, and Francis is independent of the service as well, just for context. Thank you. So the report conducts a review of how the Salvation Army contract elapsed as a result of the request from the Housing Adult Social Care Scrutiny Committee. The public speaker is quite right. There is not a link to that report at the back of the report. That is an omission. So we'll, if we can add that to the minutes, we'll supply that. The links to the report were originally working. Again, we'll make sure the committee get working links as a result of the committee, so I apologise for that. Can I also identify that in paragraph 2, that the it states in the last sentence, it clarifies and builds upon a report with the same purpose received by this committee on 28th of February. Can I clarify that it doesn't build on that report? It is a completely separate report, and the original report was withdrawn. And I thank the chair for highlighting that particular point. And as outlined by the Director of Governance, this is focused on contractual process and decision making throughout the contract's life cycle. So you can see in the report, paragraph 46 talks about the new legislation to prevent homelessness that came in April 2017. And as with all councils, the council had to quickly deliver the new duties that required housing authorities to intervene at early stages to prevent homelessness and to take reasonable steps to prevent and relieve homelessness to all eligible applicants, not just those with priority need. Paragraph 7 outlines that this was needed to be brought in very quickly, and therefore it was decided that at an executive member decision session that we needed to bring in a service. This resulted in an officer decision to award a contract to the Salvation Army following an open procedure tender exercise. And that's an important point, is that this wasn't an award directly to the Salvation Army. This was an open exercise of which any organisation could bid who met the conditions of the tender. Ultimately, the contract between City of York Council and the Salvation Army was signed. It had a commencement date of 1st of August 2018 and an end date of 31st of March 2023, and this was clear to all parties. The date appeared on the front cover of the contract and contained all usual clauses around breach and variation which were included in the contract. This was triggered in November 2022 when there was a consultation between the two parties around a matter, but that was not activated after clear consultation with the two parties, which is in accordance with the contract. The variation provisions in clause 12 were used to agree a 6-month extension to the contract from April 2023 to 30th of September 23. And that was to facilitate a review of housing related support and resettlement services. Proper process was followed to ensure that a waiver was approved to complete the extension process. That is normal process if we're extending contracts, and those are signed off by statutory officers and are completely in line with the council's procedure rules. The decision to extend was properly made under authority delegated to officers, and the approach was noted in a member decision session on 9th of February 2023. There were, as part of that extension, there was already strong advice from the Director of Finance that there should not be any extension further, and that's outlined in paragraph 24 in the report. Internal communications between August and mid-September 2023, towards the end of that period, identified that there was a possibility of a further short extension to the contract from 30th of September 2023 in order to bring the arrangements, new arrangements into place. And the new arrangements were around the outcome of the review of the resettlement pathway, which identified that the service delivered under this contract had been superseded by the new navigator model. The service offered up the full contract value, £96,000 per annum, as a saving for 2024-25, and this was agreed by Executive Full Council and Full Council as part of the 24-25 budget. Ultimately, the outcome of the internal discussions was to allow a 1 month extension to allow that transition to take place. And there was a letter to this effect from the Director of Housing, and that's outlined in paragraph 17. The letter made it clear that if the 1 month extension was not accepted, the effective end date of the contract would return to the 30th of September. The internal arrangements were made for that paperwork to, for paperwork to enact that extension should it have been accepted. The Salvation Army responded to the letter on the 29th of September in correspondence with the leader rather than with officers. And they confirmed that the letter of 25th of September had been received on the 28th, and it offered too little time to agree the suitable deed of variation. And the leader reverted this immediately to officers. The further contact with officers with the Salvation Army was after the close of the contract. So in summary, the contract was lawfully due to end in March 2023, but was extended for 6 months. Again, lawfully through the use of a waiver. The decision taken in September 23 reflected the lawful lapse of the extended fixed term contract because of the navigator model that was going to be extended. However, it was acknowledged in the original version of the February 24 report to this committee that the end of contract was not managed well. Part of that was as a result of unforeseen circumstances and technical disruption. And just for the committee's information, that was around leave, including sadly bereavement and technical disruption around receipt of emails. So that's a bit more background as to why those delays took place. However, despite that, transition discussions should have taken place much earlier. It was fully foreseen in the contract as drafted that the contract would have a fixed timeline, so members should have been having those discussions well in advance of the close of the contract. Given the timings of the contract's ending, the overall strategic picture around early intervention and prevention of homelessness wasn't known at the earliest points of the original points of the ending of the contract, and explains the extension. In the final section of the report, you can see that Council commits to learning lessons around this particular issue. As part of the Council's ongoing corporate improvement journey, we'll review how contracts are managed, drawing on best practice, and taking steps it can to improve the experience of organisations who enter contractual arrangements, particularly the VCSE and SME sector. As Director of Housing and Communities, I'm committed to absolutely improving the experience of the voluntary and community sector, given the challenges they have and the resilience or lack of resilience they have in the difficult financial environment. So I think normally this contract could have been managed better, but reflecting that it was a voluntary and community sector organisation, more care could have been taken, and I commit to improving that situation. So to conclude, the Council will focus and ensure that contracts contain robust contract management provisions. So we'll say it in writing and we'll do it in action. That contract management provisions are proactively communicated and used. And there is clear advanced planning for service remodelling and retendering, including early consultation and early communication. I understand the contract management has been identified in the annual governance statement, and clearly sets out a commitment to resolve these weaknesses in control. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you. Just in terms of how we'll work through this as a committee, I think probably the best way is to kind of work down section by section, asking primarily any sort of questions, clarification, things like that to start with, and we can come back to a discussion. I think when we probably worked through the questions is probably the best way to start. I just wanted to ask to begin with, obviously this doesn't build on, but it follows a report we had in February that was withdrawn because of a number of sort of inaccuracies in that. I think this report, there's not much difference in terms of what's written, but obviously it misses out sections that were in the previous report. Is that because those were the sections that were wrong or incorrect? Is it because you weren't able as a sort of external person, you know, from outside that service to corroborate what was written in the previous report? Or, you know, is it a case of it was a bit indiscreet? Is there a sort of a reason you can share for why those sorts of sections are kind of missing?
The previous report was a housing report. This report is a process report around the decision making in terms of the contract. So that's the difference between the two reports.
Okay, but in terms of the reason we withdrew that was because it was inaccurate. So what was inaccurate, I suppose, in the previous?
That's not a matter for me. I've conducted a review, and this is my report. That's not a matter for me.
Okay, so it's not necessarily that they were inaccurate, it's that you weren't able to sort of corroborate those, or they weren't relevant to the report you were writing.
The report I've written is in terms of the decision making and the process that's being followed with reference to the decision making. I wasn't asked to review that report.
Okay, no, thank you. Okay, so if we could start, I think, working down the page, and I guess start the summary. If anybody has any questions I'd like to raise on sort of clarity in there. Okay, I do on the on section 3. I think what was difficult when reading it is that there's reference quite a lot to the issues that were caused, but it doesn't really explain what those issues were or what the effect of those issues were either on the council, the delivery of that service, or the Salvation Army. And I suppose it was just whether there was anything that could be said about what exactly the issues were that were both caused, and, you know, the impact that was felt, but also, you know, what were the issues? You know, what was the effect of the contract being not managed as well as it could have been? Is there anything you can say about that? Or?
Sorry, Chair. No, the simple answer to the question is that the necessary discussions didn't take place. When they did take place, they took the engagement took place too late. It was further complicated by issues around technical issues around the emails, but also around leave and the availability of officers. So it was a range of things, but it was already too late. I think that's a fundamental point around this in terms of a matter of internal control, is that those discussions should have started earlier. It shouldn't have been left too late. They were already too late and further complicated by those technical and leave issues at the end of the process.
Okay. Is there anything as well you can say? It says, but too little attention was paid within the contract wording. What exactly that is sort of meant by that, and what that contract wording was that too little attention was paid to?
I think that's probably a point that's applicable to several contract situations where the contract gets prepared and sealed, and there's a sigh of relief because it's been done, and there are clauses in there that perhaps need to be looked at. So if somebody wants to, if there needs to be a control issue around quality of service, for example, there needs to be wording in there that the officers of that service can easily interpret and bring into effect. Or if that can't be done, then there needs to be advice from legal services. So I think it's around making sure that the terms are very specific to the service that is being delivered, and that the service provider can be brought up to standard on that they know what's expected of them. So it's perhaps a general point, and I can't give a specific example to this contract, but there was a point where it became necessary for legal services to give advice on what can we rely upon to do something about this issue, and what can we do to address this issue. And perhaps if the wording had been better in the first instance, those issues could have been resolved easily.
Okay. Councillor Vassie?
Thank you, Chair. Much is made in the report about openness and transparency. And I'm left wondering when I read these opening paragraphs, why is the contract not included in the documents here so that we can actually understand what is going on? There's reference all the way through this document to the contract, what wasn't done, how it was done, how it wasn't done. And I'm struggling to see how the scrutiny committee can form a view as to how the council has dealt with all of this if we don't see the contract.
I think if I can, Chair, it would not be a common practice, either here or at most councils that I'm aware of, to reproduce contract documents in reports. Not only are they very long and technical, they're often confidential. So it's a common reason. Potentially, if the scrutiny committee wants to look at the contract, we can arrange for that to happen, but that may then have to take any discussions they have into a private session, because it would be an exempt document.
If I can respond, Chair, I mean, given that this is about a contract that didn't work, it seems to me that it may not be normal to do it, but that is very much what we should be doing, is to understand the contract and what the issues were, and to be able to put context to all of this. And if it has to be done in private session, so be it. I mean, I've yet to be persuaded why such a contract could not be an open and transparent document, but it does seem to me fundamental to scrutiny being able to understand what's happened here, to have sight of that contract.
Chair, the outside perspective, this isn't the scrutiny committee, this is the audit committee. And how the scrutiny committee carries out its functions are distinct from how the audit committee carries out its functions. And you have been advised right at the beginning of this that the original report that was produced was extending it, perfectly reasonable to have a report that said the things that were in there, but not the audit committee. The audit committee's functions are more narrowly drawn. The audit committee is also a high-level committee. It's looking at policy strategy issues that are impacting on the organisation. And you get into the weeds if you get in too much detail. It's perfectly possible to say, should there be an audit report on how this worked? Should there be an audit report on how all of the contracting works? Should the scrutiny committee be expected to do certain things? I also think it might be reasonable to have a private section to let the hair down, possibly for people to try and get a feel for things, because in almost all organisations outside local government, you wouldn't have an audit committee fully in public session. In fact, you would rarely have audit committees in a public body, but you do in local government. That's a principle. Given the principle, that doesn't mean there aren't constraints on what you can deal with in public, and contracting is usually a big no-no in terms of the kind of things. You have a relationship with other people when you're contracting, and you have to be a little careful what you do with contracting documentation.
Okay. Sorry.
Thanks. So I agree that I don't think we need to go through the contract wording, but I think what we're missing here, which is what I think the committee should be focusing on, is a degree of assurance on what the issue was, and a degree of assurance on the fact that those issues have been mitigated, rather than the wording of contracts, which I'm not too worried about personally. I've read the report over twice, and I can't identify quite what the issue is. I know what happened, due to the variation and the communications and lack of availability means that it was timed out. What I'm struggling to understand, I think, is what that meant. Did that mean that we were paying a supplier without a service, which I don't think we're saying? Does that mean that vulnerable people weren't receiving a service that should have been contracted because it lapsed? Is it just bad practice and we learn that it's bad practice, et cetera, et cetera? And without understanding those issues, I can't quite understand what assurance we need as a committee to, if we got what I'm trying to say is, can we be provided with some assurance that a contract of twice the value, 3 times the value is quite a low level, this one isn't going to lapse next week and officers wouldn't know about it. It's the controls around some fairly fundamental contract management principles, whether that's internal audit or assurance from officers that it wouldn't happen again. There's some sort of controls that are being put in place to mitigate whatever the issue was. Apologies, that might not have been very clear, but.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think the points being made there are really quite fundamental. So what happened is that the contract followed its journey that you would expect it to follow. A decision was made to tender the contract, the procurement exercise was gone through, a decision was made who to award it to, the contract was drawn up. It was all very normal until the end, when there was a little bit of a hurry around extension number 1, and then realisation that extension number 2 was really not well advised. And the communication at that time, as is described in one of the final paragraphs, fell to some annual leave period, some technical issues of emails not being received on time. So it became a little bit hurried and untidy at the end. But when you say, well, I'm not really sure what the issue was, there weren't too many issues in terms of, what was done was, as from a legal perspective, was as I would have expected to see. A waiver was sought when it needed to be sought. A deed of variation was executed when it needed to be executed. All good practice, communication, and those softer, well, they're not softer, they're very important, but the non-writing of documents bits that lawyers get less involved with, perhaps, didn't help. So perhaps it's a bit of a boring report because there wasn't really too much of a worrying nature to say, other than our contract management could have been better, certainly in terms of communication. And are we really good at identifying, how regular performance monitoring should happen? Do we really put it into effect? When we draft it, do we pay attention to that and really make sure it happens? So there's definitely some learning in there. But in terms of the process that I would expect to have seen to seal a contract, to extend a contract, to decide to enter a contract, all as I would have expected to see.
These supplementaries or?
Yeah, I don't think we have. I've not got the sense that we should be looking at the original contract. The issue is what's happened since the original contract. Can I be clear on what protocols, guidance exists for managers of contracts within the council in terms of how they should deal with renewal of contracts? That's my first question. And the second question, what training arrangements do we have for our different contract managers on those protocols and guidance? It's my first 2 questions.
Okay. Yeah, the Director of Finance is not here, but if she was here, she would say that we have the contract procedure rules, which are quite a detailed guide, they're part of the Constitution, which outline the arrangement that we have to make in terms of considering the business case for letting a contract, the reason for the service, how it should be procured, the options that are considered, and then the process that follows, including the drawing up of the contract and the terms of the contract, and then monitoring it. I think there's an acknowledgement that there hasn't been as much training in the council as we would have liked in the past. There was many years ago when we had more staff in the council, which has reduced over time. And I think we recognise, and it was mentioned in the peer review report around financial knowledge and experience that this is particularly an area we want to concentrate on in the future. And the resources as a result of the council's restructure going into finance are going to be bolstered, including a particular focus on financial procedures and procurement. And of course, we've got new procurement legislation coming in that will require much more detailed knowledge by managers about procurement processes and proper contract management. My concern from obviously my community's responsibilities is that we do not make the lives of the community and voluntary sector more difficult by the way that we manage our contracts with them. So that's my commitment to the future, that we do that much better. And I'll be talking to York CVS around that, but that's not a process issue. That's just a commitment from me.
Okay. Pleased that there is something in place and a recognised training need that hopefully will be addressed in future. But does the existing guidance explain what a contract manager should do when a contract is up for renewal, is coming up for renewal? When should they start a review? When should that be? You know, what timescales should that be done to, and so on?
I haven't got that information. I can't tell you that.
Do we know that's right?
Chair, if I may, I do know that the procurement team and legal services work together through a procurement forward plan, which highlights all of the upcoming exercises. I'm afraid I can't say where the services then interact on that and what cues there are to managers within the services, but I assume the information would come from them and is collated centrally by procurement. So certainly there is a system in there, and it revolves around the procurement forward plan, but the experts on that would be Debbie and her head of procurement.
Well, are you saying that you haven't looked at that issue as part of this review? Because I would have thought it's a fairly fundamental question for any reviewer of our processes to understand why we ended up being late. If there's no guidance, you know, what was it in fact just left to the manager to decide when they choose to review it? Because the evidence is, you know, on the dates here, they only started to review it 1 month before they had to give the notice of whether to extend the contract or not.
Yeah, I think to be fair, as sorry, off mic, Francis has just said they need to review it because actually it wasn't long since they'd last reviewed it. So this is firmly in the services.
Sorry, I'm referring to the original contract extension.
I don't think there were any issues with the original contract extension. I'm not aware of any.
Well, as I say, I'm just trying to understand the times, you know, the processes. You know, it was, in effect, they had no choice but to extend it for 6 months if they only actually started thinking about what they should be doing 1 month before the 3 months notice. According to this, sorry, I'll go back to the right paragraph.
I think, Chair, if I can answer that, officers were clear as to the reasons why they needed an extension, which was to make sure that there was continuity of service whilst they finalised their thoughts around the future of the service in line with their strategy. But so there would have been a gap in service.
Why hadn't that been done in advance of the consideration of the end of the original contract?
Because these things take some time, and it was a significant change in service.
That's the point I'm trying to get at. That's my understanding. It usually takes some time. Why, in our guidance, don't we say to officers, if a contract's due to end on date X, do we not commence a review 9 months in advance or whatever is appropriate? Because here it appears they only started doing that 4 months in advance, and only 1 month before they needed to give the notice to extend the contract.
Sorry, Chair, we don't know what those discussions we don't know. We haven't got here the procedurals that say what that guidance is, but all we can rely on is that thinking did take place against the first extension, in order to make sure that there was no gap in service. What we're saying is that the second extension wasn't properly thought about, wasn't properly engaged with, and therefore fell down and did not give, in our view, an appropriate ending to this contract. The previous extension seems perfectly reasonable, to avoid any gap in service.
Well, only if you're actually suddenly near the end of the contract and you have no choice.
Okay, I think we've gone round in circles a bit now. Councillor Rose.
Thanks, Chair. And I guess the slight challenge here is that bullet point 3 that we're on is the summary point, says everything in it. So I've got a lot of other questions that I'm saving up, but I could fit into this. But I just want to make a quick double point on this. And by the way, agreed on all the points around opening up contracts, public-private meetings, all that stuff. I think if we want to go and look through contracts, we could. I've been in 10-hour meetings when you've already written the contract yourself and it's difficult to get into the details. So I don't think that's really doable in one of these meetings. But the two specific points for me is, number one, in the report that doesn't exist from February, one of the things taken out is a whole swathe of paragraphs about an ongoing review in 2021, 2022 that is missing from this report. That is this bit of the conversation we're going around on in the last few minutes around the discussions about the long-term plan, and the review had to be paused because people weren't there, etc. So there's a whole bunch of stuff missing from there. I'd quite like to get into when we get to paragraph 10. But the other point is that all the discussions that you guys have brought around the contract being okay, I mean, I don't disagree. But when we're getting to the point around that renewal or not, and specifically around procurement, that's where, when I was first in this conversation almost a year ago, and then it came through multiple committees, it was always about that re-procurement, because you have to start that process in September 2022 for the renewal in March 23 to know if you're extending, to know if you're renewing, to know if you're going out to tender or not. So if we're going to end up with every question being, we haven't got the head of procurement here and it's a procurement question, I'm really concerned right now at the start that we're going to get ourselves a bit stuck. So I just want to make those 2 points on 3 of, I don't think there is anything wrong with the contract. It is legal for us to have extended it. There were challenges at the very end about the renewing of it. That is detailed in the report, and I'm comfortable about the technicalities of contracting. But that procurement process of, in the summer before, it should have already been a discussion and an agreement. And then it wasn't because there was a renew, but the renew never really finished and it just kind of happened. That's the entire space where the problem seems to be for a lot of these issues. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but if there's anything around that you can speak to in light of what David was just talking about, that'd be appreciated. Bit of a fuzzy one, sorry.
Chair, if I can just respond by referring back to the remit. So the minute that the report begins with in paragraph 2 is that the Chair and Vice Chair write to the Chair of Audit and Governance to request that they consider, additional to their other commitments, a review of how the Salvation Army contract, slightly unusual word, elapsed. So it's for that reason that this report doesn't go into what considerations were going around in the housing team, and actually as independents we don't have access to that information anyway. So this was done objectively as to, well, how did it end, what process did it go through, and that's to try to match to the minute and the request that was made.
And I think ultimately, Chair, the stage we've got to now is that probably members around the table understand that the process in legal terms for the contract life was within the legal parameters, fine. There were clearly communication issues that need to be resolved, and I know Pauline's committed to those. But also what we're now looking at is the broader picture of contract management, and that's not necessarily something for this report. It's probably a broader piece of work whether that be by internal audit having a look at it, whether it be by a further report to the committee on something else. But it's not necessarily, you're absolutely right, Councillor Merritt, that the fundamental here is about how we manage contracts as they're coming to an end. And that wasn't really the problem here, because the contract was allowed to lapse, and that was always the intention. The problem here was particularly communication. But there is perhaps the broader question of what do we do about contract management for other contracts? And that, as I say, is probably a broader piece of work outside of this.
Yes, I guess a slight challenge on that, if I may, is you've said that it was always intended that the contract lapse. And I have to say, in every single meeting I've been in the last year, in every single report, that has not been said once until now, that the intention was to make a review and to make a decision on whether we were lapsing, going out to retender, whether we're entering, bringing in-house. And at some point, a decision was definitely made that the reablement service internally was going to cover everything, etc. But it certainly wasn't a year and a half in advance, or at least not a formal decision made. And it ended up being made when we couldn't renew it any further and we had no time to retender. Now, it might have been intentional in the ether, but that wasn't proper governance of that decision around retendering and
that comes, so you're absolutely right, Councillor, and that comes back to the whole contract management question of when do you start to look at these? When do you start to make your decisions about what you're going to do with the contract? So here, clearly, by the time the extended end of the contract was approaching, there was obviously a clear view internally that the contract would be allowed to lapse because there was an alternative provision that was going to be in place to take over the contract that was, well, the requirements of the contract. How well that was communicated is very much up for debate, and I think, as I say, that's clearly been acknowledged. But it's that broader question of how do we set the parameters for contracting managers and individual contract managers of when do you start to talk about this? When do you start to think about what you're going to do at that end point? And should it be 6 months ahead of time, 12 months ahead of time, or wherever? And I think that's the broader piece of work that I'm talking about that probably is outside of this report, because this report isn't specifically about that.
Is this the same
it's a
question?
Supplemental. I don't know if yours is supplemental, but I guess my question is, for me, it's about the decision being made, and I can't see anything in that. The way that we do decisions as a council, I can't see a decision being made that we're bringing in-house at any point in this process until it had been brought in-house. So that aspect of it, which again is about process, which again is about the procurement process in particular, that timeliness of it, I think we're all in agreement around where this challenge lies, but that's not what this report has been written to address. I understand why. I understand the wording. I'm looking at the minutes from November for health scrutiny, where that's the bullet point that comes out, but that wasn't the discussion that was held there. And the way that it's phrased as a request to look at the contract was the contracting in general, the end of the contract, the renewal. I appreciate why that hasn't come through, but I really don't want us to leave this committee and come back to this committee again, which is currently where we're hurtling towards. I really want us to be able to bottom it out. And at the moment, I'm left guessing what I think happened around procurement and where there might have been gaps based on a report that doesn't quite exist, that goes into a bit of detail on it, and a report that does exist that does a good job of talking about the contract, but not the bit of contracting procurement that we're interested in here. And I can't tell when a decision was made to bring the service in-house, and that all of that concerns me.
Thank you, Chair. If you look at paragraph 25, you can see that part of this decision-making was around making a budget saving. That was openly and transparently in the budget papers for 24-25 and was agreed by Executive and full Council as part of the 24-25 budget process. So ultimately, the ultimate aim of this was to make quite a significant saving as well as ensure continuation of the service. So that's the ultimate outcome, although I accept that the date of the cessation of the contract was in the previous September, but that was obviously stopping it. That wasn't a re-procurement. I think this is really important. This was a decision not to continue with a contract that was coming to its natural life's end. And that's a decision we can all take as managers to not continue with the contract and put some alternative provision in place. Now, the council received funding for that service, which enabled it to make the longer term revenue saving. But that's why that decision was made, to be able to continue that service at lower cost to the council and therefore not continue with a contract. We don't publish a decision every time we stop a procurement arrangement with a contractor.
Similarly, it's something about a decision to not do something doesn't end up being recorded, but presumably there is a decision to have done the alternative.
Sorry, Chair. If we were proceeding to procure, then yes, there would be a decision because that's in our procurement regulations.
Councillor Wetzel.
Thank you, Chair. I'm concerned that there seems to be a suggestion that what this is about is learning lessons for the future. Yes, there are lessons for the future, but this is also about a situation that had a direct impact on some of the most vulnerable people in York. And that raised serious concerns for health and housing scrutiny that were aired repeatedly. We heard from Councillor Merritt and Councillor Rose that surely the procurement process must have been in place to start looking at it 6 months before that elapsed. I would still expect that to be part of whatever contract was agreed. The idea that there are just abstract lessons to be learned afterwards that are somehow not related to what was in that agreement between the two parties seems to me far-fetched. And what I'm feeling is that we're still in a situation where the council is marking its own homework. And unfortunately, I don't think that's going to deliver a positive result for understanding what happened in relation to this particular contract, but for all the other outside bodies that the council has relationships with. So I'm still very concerned that we're not actually facing the challenges and problems that got us to where we are. When I read, little attention was paid to contract wording and contract management meetings to ending it well and all of that. There's all this reference to a contract and there were two parties and all those things that have been rehearsed by Councillor Merritt and Councillor Rose should have been in that. And rather than simply talking in the abstract about what comes next, I think we do have to understand what has happened here. And if we can't do it in-house, then I think there has to be an independent audit.
Almost getting back to ask the Director of Governance to remind the members what the role of the Audit Committee is. And the role of the Audit Committee isn't to act as the chief officers of departments, as the executive of the authority, nor is it to act as the scrutiny committee of the relevant spending department. It's meant to be a fairly high level activity. And if you identify an issue, some other people have got to look at it, not the audit committee. Otherwise, you really will have very long meetings every day, 200 days a year. There's some real problems in here. The area which concerned me was the thing between the first report on this one, which is one of the perceived weaknesses of this authority is around governance and it's about culture of members. And in the earlier version, there was some suggestion that the difficulties in reaching decisions related to the willingness of an executive member to make decisions. Now, I don't want to get into all of that stuff, but the relationship between officers and executive members of the council become difficult if the officers say, this is what our advice is, and the executive member is making sure that that decision is being effectively taken within a timescale. That's a different set of issues to this. The contracting appears to have been all right, The muddle may lie between officers and members and to do with governance, not to do with informing the contractee around what was going on. And it's necessary to stay high. And if you were to write action list points from this, one of the action list points is, who should all of this stuff be referred back to do some stuff, who then report back to the audit committee, not what the audit committee should now do itself. Apart from, as I say, there may be some issues about governance, which aren't reflected in this report, but are reflected in this issue.
Thank you. Councillor Fisher.
Thank you very much. I totally agree with you that the matter of the effect of the ending of the contract on the homeless is completely a matter for another committee. But this is an audit committee. One of the things we manage is risk. One of the big risks is reputational damage, and there has been massive reputational damage to this council as a result of this situation that's arisen. I'm not assigning blame at this moment because I don't think I have all the information to do it. But what we do need is to get assurance that the wording in paragraph 3, which says too little attention was paid within the contract wording, which suggests that the contract itself may not have been written quite as in such a watertight manner as it needed to be to end the contract satisfactorily. It was a contributing factor in my mind to that reputational damage. And I think we need to be assured that such matters aren't going to occur in other contracts that we might have going on, that this hand grenade that we've got with this one is not going to recur somewhere down the line. So I think an audit would be absolutely in order. Who should do it, independent or in-house? I'd go for independent personally. I think we need to look at contract management and the wording of our contracts as a matter of some urgency to ensure we're getting it right. Otherwise, there'll be more reputational damage, and that is our response.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm just going to make one final quick point before we start to go into paragraph 4 onwards. But I just to respond with acknowledgement of the points that you guys have made and acknowledgement of the feelings in the room as well, because it is obviously an important topic and there's a lot of heat to it. I mean, we have to look forward at lessons learned and not focus on what the impact was. And the decision was made that internally we can do the same job. So theoretically there is no impact to the decision. But you know, if we make a decision or not a decision to end a major contract and that isn't recorded anywhere, that is a concern for me. And if that's not a conversation for today, then let's take that offline as well. But there was a decision made in September 22 not to extend and not to go out to retender at that point in time. There were conversations in November 22 around early termination, and then in March it was extended for 6 months. But the extension was to finish a review that was theoretically ongoing at the time. And the way you described it was that this was a planned natural end to a contract. And I just don't see any evidence that that was the case. If it was planned to end, it shouldn't have extended in March, or it should have been extended specifically as an offboarding 6-month period. I don't understand this September 22, November 22, where there was just no decision made and conversations about termination didn't actually lead to a decision recorded. I think so. We could get into those details. I'm just trying to explain where I'm coming from in terms of that decision. Even in absence of a decision that isn't a decision shouldn't be recorded, which I do question. There were still decisions here at each of those points, even if they weren't decision sessions that should be recorded at a macro level. We did decide to extend, and the reasons for those were documented in multiple reports. That's my concern. But I think we can get into the details in the paragraphs reflecting those probably.
Okay, Councillor Lewis.
It's a kind of minor question, but it's troubling me. So there was a decision made because the service already existed. The navigator system replaced this Salvation Army contract. And I just wonder, at what point did people realise that the service was already being covered so that this contract could elapse? And it is very confusing that at one point, at the 11th hour, there's an extension of a contract going on. Then it lapses, but then there's already a contract, already a process in place. And I don't understand that from what I'm reading here, and I've read it several times. And I don't know if that makes sense to anybody listening to what I'm saying, but at what point did somebody realise that this system to protect homeless people already existed so that it could lapse safely? And why wasn't that realised maybe earlier to avoid all this messy business that went on towards the end of the contract?
Is there any light you can
well, it's difficult for me to answer because I wasn't here at the time, and these are housing questions. My understanding is that we had funding to trial the navigators service, and it worked. And then there were they had to bring in very quickly arrangements as a result of the 2017 legislation, so therefore that was the reason for the contract. But then when trialling the prevention work in terms of using navigators, it was felt that actually the service would work much better by bringing those two services together, because there was a risk of duplication. And clearly this was a very costly contract, and it was important for the best use of the council's funding to bring that together, and it ultimately has saved a significant amount of money, and that service has continued. I absolutely take the point that was made at scrutiny and Councillor Vassey's point around guarantees around the version of the service that exists now, and I think that is a real scrutiny issue, is to understand what's in place now and how does it compare, and how are we going to take it forward in terms of housing. And I think that's their answers that you should get. And I know that you're having the strategic direction discussion at the next scrutiny committee in September. Perhaps we can have a discussion about that then. So that's coming away from the audit and governance responsibilities, but hopefully that demonstrates to you that actually not only was there learning from a trial and a pilot and an identification of potential duplication, but actually there was quite a significant financial saving for the authority as a result of that as well.
Okay. If we could make a bit of progress then. I know Councillor Whitcroft's been waiting patiently. We move on then to looking at the background, paragraph 4 to 9-ish.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. I just wanted to ask a bit about the funding, basically, particularly around the new burdens doctrine. It provided, as it says, 72 million nationally for the Homelessness Reduction Act. Seems to me a woefully small amount for the entire country. But I just wanted to know about what the process was for how does the new burdens doctrine work in terms of how do we apply for funding from it? And if it is from national funding, how will we be able to make a saving from it? Which is referenced on point 25. I just want to try and understand the money and the funding system here.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. No.
I can provide a little information in relation certainly to how new burdens funding works. Theory certainly is that when the government introduces a new requirement, gives us a new statutory duty, it acknowledges that that places an additional burden on us, and the government therefore makes a decision as to how much funding nationally it's going to provide, and then uses its own formula to determine how much each authority gets. So we don't necessarily apply for it. It's simply given to us as part of, you now have to do X duty, and we're going to give you Y amount of money to deliver it.
And so the saving that was made from this.
Well, my assumption would be, and as I say, it has to be an assumption, is that new burdens funding lasts for a set period of time. It usually does, because they tend to expect that we mainstream the funding after a period of time. So the new burdens funding isn't forever. It's usually time limited. Clearly, there is a different funding stream for the service that's now in place, and we've been able to deliver a saving through that funding stream rather than it coming out of new burdens funding. I hope that helps.
Okay, there's no further questions on the background section. If we move then to paragraphs 10 onwards, the extension and subsequent end of the contract. If anybody has any questions for clarification primarily. So Rose looks like he does.
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess a continuation of the same in some respects, which is why I was hoping other people go first and tick some of it off. But we're talking about the expiry date of the 31st of March and the subject to the termination. I mean, I think it sounds, without seeing the contract, but it sounds pretty clear that in the contract it was acknowledged it was 31st of March with a provision for 6-month extension. The question for me is about that decision to go to tender, that it should be September 2022 when you're coming up on that point. Bring it back to originally when you make a decision of whether it's staying in-house or not. And I can't see a decision having been made that effectively we're auto awarding that contract to the council rather than going out to tender. In the missing papers from February, it talks about this review at that point in time, but it doesn't say months. So I can't work out if that's way before September 22 or during it or ongoing. It started certainly at some point around there or earlier, and then possibly even 2021, and then doesn't seem to have ended until after to March 23. But in the middle of that, it says all existing resettlement contracts will be extended, and some of them were extended into 2024. It talks about the risk that further extensions of the contract being contravention of public contract regulations, and the phrases at the time. I don't want to get into the bits that were removed from the report, but it talks about not wanting to let the contract end with the other contracts being extended. But it sounds like at that point in time we already had this capability that Jane was talking about around the fact that we could do this in-house was known at that point in time, and then the kind of revised strategy commissioning approach that was supposed to lead into what the permanent plan was didn't really finish because of the departure of the review project manager and director of adult social care, to quote that paper. So I'm just trying to get an idea of that decision made at that point in time, that we weren't going to start the process. I think in September 2022, there was an idea of vision from what I can get by reading between the lines heavily, which I don't like to do, that we think that the review can be completed before March and that decision in March can be made. But the decision wasn't made in September to extend that by 6 months. It was kind of pushed until March. I just wonder if there's any clarity you can give around that September. I appreciate you're not necessarily the best person. I feel bad for you being here talking about lots of things that you went in the middle of, but is there any way that you can kind of give us an idea of what was discussed around September, of whether there was an expectation this review would be completed and what that would lead to, whether the review was already effectively predetermined that we would bring it in-house and the review was not really a review, why then there was a discussion in November about potential early termination that then wasn't followed through, and why in March it then didn't lead to termination. That stretch of time from September 22 to March 23, I just don't really understand the conversations, the decisions, and then none of the decisions being made in a decision session around that, up to the point where the contract was extended. I get why there isn't a decision when you're not deciding to extend it, but those conversations needed to have happened earlier. Any clarity you can give around what was said or thought at that time would be really helpful.
Thank you, Chair. So I can answer a little part of that. And that's just to say that appropriate consultation was had with legal services around resolving a contractual issue, and it was resolved without the need for early termination. So again, it's more a matter of saying, well, from a process point of view, I can see from when the legal file was opened, that we were asked to advise on an issue that arose in relation to the operation of the contract. Advice was given, the matter was duly resolved, and the prospect of early termination went away. I can't answer all of the other part of the question, is what was happening in terms of remodelling of the services within housing.
I guess that answered the point around the early termination being that that's a separate issue. It wasn't related to conversations of, in general, there being a challenge with the contract. But I guess taking that out of the picture, there's still that question of the expectation of it terminating in March and why there was a need for an extension at all if we were covering it in-house, and at what point that conversation was made that we would need to extend, or that we weren't going out to retender for an extra multiple year contract, that space.
Chair, I can perhaps add that the waiver documentation gives some justification around that. So again, it's the waiver form is a fairly short form, and it gives some I'll have it in front of me, and I can and refer to it at length if the Director of Governance thinks it's appropriate to read from it. But there is sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, it's around the revision and the remodelling of the service, and the need to buy time to do that. And that's one of the usual reasons that we see a waiver, is that there is some progress towards changing the way a service is delivered, and we haven't got there in time. We're not at a point that we can ensure a seamless transition. And I think it's a point that's been properly raised by members, is how are we going to ensure a seamless transition and no lapse in service for citizens? Well, a waiver and an extension is one of the tools that we use to ensure a seamless transition. And that's something that I see fairly regularly. So there will be a short justification. It's something that the officers that sign off the waiver have to see.
I totally appreciate that, I guess. And I don't think there's any problem with the 6-month waiver. From what I can tell, as far as I can tell from all the papers and conversations, that waiver was done properly. The question is what the reason for the waiver was. Is the waiver because we were already planning on replacing it? We couldn't quite replace it by March 2023, so we extended it to help finish that onboarding and make sure it was fully ready and that there was no gap in service. Was it extended for this alleged review that was still ongoing, that wasn't completed in that time frame, that the review might have suggested that we retender it, or that there was a gap that needed extension? Because if that's the case, we didn't have time, under this to be able to then extend that contract any further. It's that binary decision that happened in that space sometime around winter 22, 23, that was either that the waiver was extended to just plug the gap while the new service was finishing being built, or was because the review hadn't completed. And I know it wasn't your decision, but if that's the bit, is what's that reason for that waiver? Was it because there was a review ongoing, or because we were just taking time to set up the service?
Chair, I signed the waiver, so that's along with other officers. So I saw it and I have it in front of me, and it is clear from the wording on the waiver. Intention is for the service to be brought in house rather than a further contract being awarded. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's certainly what was included within the waiver.
It very much answers my question in a way that none of these reports have. Ask some more questions, but I'll leave that for anybody else to ask if they want to ask details on that.
And I think there's a bit more information on the background in paragraph 11 of the February report, which talks about the review starting in 21-22 and being interrupted by the departure of the review leader and those sorts of issues that perhaps extended it longer than it might have otherwise been. Mr. Lee.
Chair, we're a bit over an hour in. We're up to paragraph 10, roughly. There are 23 paragraphs to go, and we're not functioning as an audit committee. This is not the way to do it. There's a lot of complex detail that people are wanting to revise, including, I know this from another place, and this doesn't sit with my former knowledge, which not everybody else in the committee has got. Either the report is meeting the requirement of an audit committee as narrowly drawn, and then there are some points arising from the report which members may wish to make as to where it goes from here, but what more work needs to be done out. That's fair enough. But to continue lashing through it paragraph by paragraph and getting people to imply they know more than they do, or asking them more than they do, it ain't going to work, folks. You've got a report, you accept it or you don't. It can't be built on very much as sits. You can ask for some other material to be presented in a sensible form, or you can send it somewhere else to be dealt with, which I think in some of these issues might be more appropriate. If you want to set up a working group with a few representatives of the audit committee, if you think you are the right people to go through more detail. But this is going to break everyone's spirit. And what is the output to be? What is going to come up at the end of this? What is a minute going to look like? What is the action points going to look like? What has this achieved?
I take the point, but we have been presented with a report, and what I see is the committee trying to understand the report that they've been presented with so that they're able to form those sorts of judgments. The difficulty with a report like this is that no doubt necessarily a lot of it is built on things that are confidential. And so we are having to try and read between the lines. And unfortunately, that means that we are not really in a position to understand many of the things we need to.
Then have a confidential session. Yeah.
Well, that may be. Councillor Lasson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not feeling broken over this. I think it's important, and I'm quite happy to spend time doing it. That's our function as far as I'm concerned. It seems to me that what we're getting, and we are beginning to get a clearer sense of what's happened. At the heart, this is about openness, transparency, and trust to me. We're getting a sense that the council was looking to make a seamless transition to some other status quo for managing these issues about looking after homeless people and rough sleepers. What we're not getting an idea of yet, to my ears, is that the other party in this contract was understanding what was happening in any way. And I would like to think, and I have to go back to the contract, I would like to think that in a relationship between two parties, there's a degree of openness and communication, because the other party also has to plan what it's going to do in the years ahead. It can't just be told on a Friday afternoon, that's it, we've switched everything off, we want a seamless transition. There are many parties involved in this. The paragraph 9 refers to the contract again, and paragraph 8 about 7 and 8 evolving approaches to prevention and all of this. I'm quite confident that the council wants to do the best thing, but again, we don't see the contract. So surely the contract included provision for regular review. Did the parties meet regularly? If they met regularly, wouldn't that have been an opportunity to discuss possible changes going forwards to the contract so that both sides could be ready? To me, that's fundamental to how not only we look at what happened here, but looking forward at what happens with our relationships with other outside bodies on the council. I would have thought that a lot of people are looking at this and wanting to have the confidence that if they enter into a 3-year contract, a 2-year contract, whatever it is, that at the end of it, they're going to have more than 5 minutes notice or whatever, that something's going to come to an end. I'd still like to hear a bit more about that relationship. We've heard that the contract could have been better. Is what being said here that there weren't regular reviews, there weren't those opportunities to talk, that people weren't really fundamentally keeping in touch with each other? Is that what's implied here?
At the end of the process, to our understanding, that's what we've been told. I understand there was a relationship, an ongoing relationship, and there were discussions. I cannot comment on the quality of those discussions, how often they took place. Other people in the room might be able to. But we do know that that fell down at the end, and that caused all the issues at the end of the process, and that needs to be a better process going forward, so that we can give time for transition and planning.
If I may, just to add a comment that might help, I suppose. I think the assumption has to be, if you have a fixed term contract, that in the absence of a timely discussion in advance that says we're going to extend this, you know that at the end of the contract it finishes. So if you take out a lease for a car for 5 years, you know that at the end of 5 years you've got to give it back, unless you talk to the lease company and agree that you're going to keep it for longer. And I think that's the basis upon which all of our contracts work, that it has an end date. Some contracts that we will enter into will by definition be extended or retendered. So power, gas, electricity, all the rest, we can't stop having it. Some contracts won't. And if you have an end date in a contract, the expectation must be the contract ends at that point, unless we come to you and talk. And I think the problem here in part seems to be that by the time there was a consideration of in sort of August, September last year, perhaps we should extend for a further brief period to allow a winding down. Those discussions didn't happen until too late. Now, you know, that's deeply unfortunate, and I think that's one of the nubs of the problem here, that communication was an issue. And you've heard the director over there explain that that's something that we will absolutely look to improve. As to the contents of the contract and whether or not it was properly drafted, nobody in this room will know what it said when it was being drafted and what the instructions were. Certainly, you'd have to go back at least 2 monitoring officers before me to find out who was in charge then. I suspect that it's the same for Francis. I would like to think, and certainly knowing some of the personalities involved in drafting legal contracts now, that is no longer an issue if it was a problem here, because I know the degree of attention that's paid. We're in deep discussions at the moment over a very small contract. So I know that the legal officers involved now are extremely fastidious about what goes into contracts, how they word them, so that those provisions are clear. And they should be clear to both sides, and that includes the commissioning manager, the contract manager, who should understand from a contract what their obligations are. And if it says quarterly meetings, you have quarterly meetings and you note them and all the rest. So I suspect we are in a significantly different place now than we were 5 years ago, certainly just from the personalities involved. How far that takes you, I don't know, but I think that's hopefully a useful little explanation.
When we're talking about communication and the communication not being good, what do we mean? In the other report, it sort of implied that the communication that was going on was sort of giving the Salvation Army a different impression that actually the contract might continue. Hence why perhaps they came in quite late to ask what was happening. Is it that communication, you know, in what way was the communication about? Is it that they were getting the wrong information? Is it that they were getting no information? Is it that they were, you know, what about the communication was poor?
Chair, I can point to something that answers part of that, and that is that there were multiple communication channels, and that's on the face of the report. So I'm just scrolling through to find one of the later paragraphs, but there's a paragraph in there that says, well, on the one hand, there were officers exchanging emails, and then at some point, and clearly the officers who were managing the contract with senior, I don't know what they call them, officers in the Salvation Army, but then at some point, emails get diverted through to politicians and get re-diverted back to officers. So we do know, and we've seen some evidence that were some multiple channels of communication. If there was a designated contract manager on both sides, the ideal situation was that everything went through them, and that would have been a trackable and probably more effective way of communicating how this contract was going to end.
And there wasn't, presumably, and that's one of the learning points, is it that there should be, or?
It's not that there wasn't contract management going on, it's just that for various reasons, and Pauline's referred to it, that there was some absence on leave, so there were diversions, there were workarounds being used to try to bring communication in at other places, when the contract managers should have done that in advance, probably had done a large part of it, and they're allowed to take leave. But it's at that point, because it was quite late in the day, at that point people invented their own sort of workarounds, and it's on the face of the report that emails came in, I think, to the leader at some point, and they were diverted back. So I'm simply saying that multiple channels of communication are not necessarily a helpful thing when you're reaching the last final days of a contract, because that's going to be confusing.
Just as a supplementary on the communications, I'm taking from what you're saying that there was a contract manager for this contract and that named on both sides.
I can't tell you immediately whether they're named on both sides within the contract. I have got the contract in front of me. It certainly says things like the end date on the front cover, which is what the report tells you. And there are contract monitoring provisions in there. Again, not giving you the details of them, but they exist. And
the second question was supplementary to that. Are we distinguishing between, in effect, sort of the day-to-day contract management as against, the strategic management where you deal with the sort of big issues about contract renewal and so on? Is that being fully recognised in your new contracts, Bryn?
I wouldn't see the issues as being any different, personally. I think it doesn't matter whether the contract manager is dealing with day-to-day issues or the end point of a contract coming up. They still need to give it the right amount of attention at the right time. So, I'm going to say I can't produce you a current contract. It's not something I get involved with. But those clear provisions, either naming or indicating who the contract manager is, methods of communication, and certainly from an internal perspective, I would expect there to be an understanding of, if you've got a 5-year contract, at year 4 you start looking at it. That's the sort of thing that I would expect to see in if not the contract itself, then certainly the advice that we're giving to officers.
Chair, I can say that there is, whilst the Director of Governance has been addressing the committee, there's a service management provision which requires the provider to appoint a nominated officer who will manage and coordinate the service. I've not scrolled fast enough to find an equivalent provision that the council does the same thing, but clearly it was thought about, and it is good practice that you've got those nominated persons for contract management.
Thank you. Sorry, I've lost track of which paragraph we're on, but just 3 final reflections, and then to cover off the item from my perspective. First, I feel quite sure that it's not a housing issue, it's not a legal issue. I don't think it's a financial issue as well. Statutory officers are entirely within their discretion to make decisions to identify financial savings. I think what it is a procurement issue, but it's not a procurement report, which I think is why we're perhaps going around in circles a little bit. Second reflection, lessons learned. It sort of touches on it a little bit here, but doesn't quite pull them out. I would suggest the lessons learned, and I'm speculating a little bit here because I don't know the details, nor should I. 1, contracts should be QA'd. 2, you need a contracts register which sets out when the end date is. 3, I think perhaps most importantly, have business continuity arrangements so when officers are on leave. Not straightforward. And then I think just the third reflection is I don't think it would be good value for money for internal audit or anyone else to do a review of a single contract and a single deed of variation or communication that did or did not happen. I think it would be value for money to do an internal audit of contract management across the authority. And those are just sort of my final reflections, but I hope that's helpful.
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what paragraph I'm on either, but we're somewhere around 15. So I'll ask my paragraph 15 question.
I've given up with paragraphs.
This talks about late August. The February report talked about as the extended contract end date approached. Paragraph 28 says May 2024 had a report go to exec. You mentioned earlier that by June 2024 it was included in the budget savings for that year, but it presumably wasn't in the budget in February that came to us. I guess I wanted to clarify what you said previously about the waiver, that is direct evidence. The decision had been made by March 2023 that the contract was ending, that service was ending. Regardless of that extra 1 month and the communications around that at the end, the decision had been made by March, and it was about communicating that with clarity to Salvation Army. But there was no possibility beyond that point that it could go out to tender or anything like that. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that either.
Sorry. So in March, there's a waiver for the 6 months. And that waiver specifies that it wasn't to look at potentially going out to tender or taking any alternative action. At that point in time, it was definite. The contract, the service would end in September. There then was a whole thing about an extra month potentially, but that was independent of that decision. Just wanted to make sure that the decision had been made at that point in time. And after that, it was about communicating it. And then when we get into September, there was another decision about the extra month. But that was a very solid, irreversible point in time decision.
That's my understanding. The waiver document that I had in front of me at the time, I was one of a number of signatories that confirmed that we could go into that extra 6-month period. The wording was there was intention to bring in-house. So yes, what you've reflected back accords with my understanding.
Thank you. And I've got one question on 19. We'll get to it. But I just want to, I guess, clarify that I don't think we are going around in circles. I've got a lot of clarity throughout all the questions I've been asking, and I've got a series of about 7 recommendations in front of me at the moment. So thank you for all the detail you've been giving.
I mean, I've just got a question around that general area. I mean, one thing that did kind of jump out to me, I guess, is the gap in narrative between the sort of 30th of March and sort of late August, where there's a big sort of gap in what was happening behind the scenes, perhaps. I appreciate the other report was talking about meetings with the exec member. He didn't want to make this change, had a conflict of interest, sort of subsequently found, recused himself from the decision making. I'm not really sort of interested in the personalities and things, but I think there is a sort of issue in terms of nobody knew, at least externally, that the exec member had a conflict of interest in that area that meant that he wasn't kind of the decision maker. And I suppose whether that's something that should be recorded or...
And I think for clarity, my understanding is he did not have a conflict of interest. He was not employed by the Salvation Army. I understand that it had been a previous employment some decade before. So there was no actual conflict of interest, but in the interests of good governance, shall we say, he stepped away from being involved in any further discussions.
Yeah, I mean, it was clearly a decision he didn't agree with, but politicians finding a reason to not make a decision they disagree with is as old as time. And I'm sure half the ministerial trips for the government where they suddenly decide they need to visit Angola are to avoid difficult decisions. So that's just the way things work. I think the question is a sort of governance one around the arrangements when the exec member is conflicted out for whatever reason of their role. It's quite a big part of their portfolio, and that then moves to the leader. I suppose the whole point of having exec members is that the leader is very busy and needs people that are covering those areas. So I guess it's, I don't know, the sort of governance, work management side of when exec members are conflicted out of decisions. Nobody sort of, I guess, knew that was what had happened. Whether that should be recorded anywhere, that there's this decision or, area of work that the exec member is not able to do their sort of duties in, or whether that had moved somewhere else. And I guess it's just whether there's what the arrangements are around that, I guess, that ensure that there remains that sort of political oversight, because it seems like for that period from the end of March to August, that's one of the things that was missing, was a sort of political oversight looking at that, saying this is an area of reputational risk. And I don't know.
I suppose that the two heads to that are, that's why you have senior officers. So the then director of housing was more than capable of taking the decision on their own delegated authority. So had they chosen to extend the contract, then that's something that would probably be reported to executive to ensure that there was overall awareness of it. But certainly the decision to allow the contract to lapse was within the then director's lawful authority. And I think that's clear from the report that was a decision they were entitled to take. In terms of how politicians record when they are stepping away from a function for the sake of due probity, there is no recognised way of doing it. I've never come across it in any authority I've worked at. It is a matter for the individual exec members and the leader to manage between them. But again, given that technically there was no conflict of interest and that the exec member was not the decision maker, in this case, the fact that the decision maker said, I don't think it's appropriate for me to be involved in this simply because of a previous historic relationship that I had, that in and of itself doesn't need recording anywhere.
But would it be useful if it was, I suppose? Is it just so rare that actually it's not worth?
I think it's not a common occurrence. I think, despite the fact that most exec members will be appointed because they have a specific interest in the area in which they are appointed. So you'll get an exec member who has a particular interest in climate change, who'll be appointed to deal with climate change. If you're then saying, well, you know, but they can't be involved in anything that involves this specific element of climate change because they've got a close connection with it. It rather defeats the point of having elected members. And I don't think anybody would argue that that would be a good idea. It is not something that is considered necessary to record anywhere. I've never seen anything from the LGA to suggest that we need to do that. It's certainly nothing in the legislation. So it is simply a personal conflict that needs to be managed between the leader and the individual members. And as I say, in this particular case, had the member chosen to continue being involved, they would not have been legally precluded from doing so.
Chair, if in an ordinary committee meeting, a council member felt they had a conflict of interest of some kind, they would declare it during the meeting. So for an ordinary member of a council committee where an issue is under consideration, if they did not wish to take part, validly or not, they would declare it. But something was of significance, they would have been expected to put it in the register of interest, either prospectively or retrospectively. This discussion about the executive member says they're in a slightly different position, which is nobody needs to know that they thought that this might be an inappropriate thing for them to get involved in, nor how quickly they decided that it was an inappropriate issue for them to get involved in. So it may be factually correct. It is not found in the executive member system, but it would be common in the local government system for an ordinary councillor in a particular situation to declare an interest, which would be reflected in committee minutes and arguably discussion about whether it should be in the register of interests.
And I think that would be the case where you're taking decisions. I think where you're exercising your function as an executive member to provide political guidance and oversight, that's a different scenario.
And I appreciate it's not something we'll resolve now, but maybe it's something that could be considered as.
We can certainly have a think about it.
Yeah, I guess I think just picking a wider example of the same thing. We have ward member decisions over ward funding that are taken offline outside of meetings where we don't have to look and recuse us. I've regularly asked a fellow ward councillor to say, you know, this is a decision that you need to make without me for something that's happening in the ward that isn't one of these, and it doesn't need to be made in this way. But actually, there is a question, I guess, around more generally, do we need to think about councillor, not even conflicts of interest, because they're not necessarily lawful conflicts of interest, but is there a way that we should be monitoring and capturing some of this stuff in between? I don't think it's specific to this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's already been said it's not a conflict of interest. Number two, the decision was made in March, so it kind of wasn't important at that point in time. And it sounds like it was a relatively seamless transition of the members decided to take themselves out of it. It becomes the leader. The leader then has all the comms afterwards. So I don't think it's pertinent to this point, but from an A&G perspective, it's probably worth us considering at some point how we capture non-meeting interests.
Okay, that's the last thing.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this does worry me because, as we've already rehearsed, this relates to something that had a serious reputational risk for the council, as it turned out. And I think many people might have predicted that would be the case, because, as we said, it deals with some of the most vulnerable groups in our city. So I think we do need to look seriously at how delegated powers are exercised and where it's appropriate to do so. My personal view is that there are constitutional issues here that concern me greatly. That the idea that if something is below a threshold of £100,000, it automatically becomes delegated. That might sound neat and tidy, but I think we all know as elected members that there are issues and decisions that are made that have serious impacts within the city that can impact, that affect residents, that affect businesses, that affect the way the city council is seen. And my understanding is that not all local authorities approach it from the point of view of, if it's under a certain threshold, it's a delegated decision. There are forward plans where things have to be spoken and declared publicly, so that any elected member can see what is going to be decided and contribute. There are various processes that help us avoid the kind of situations that we found ourselves in. And I do understand why you said what you said about it was like a contract to buy electricity or gas. But the truth of it is, this is about a relationship with an organisation that has gone on for more than a decade, an organisation that has provided services for homeless people and vulnerable people for decades in our city. And the idea that we allow ourselves to sleepwalk into a situation where it's just a contract that has a fixed term and then we move on seems to me to do poor service to our city and our local authority. I think this report acknowledges that, but I'm still not convinced that without looking at our constitution, without it being looked at by an outside body, we'll properly understand the lessons. We've had reassurance that there's a new team of people in place and contracts are done differently. I'm really pleased to hear that. But this committee isn't hearing how that's working. And as an elected member, I feel my duty is to not just take it on trust that things are working better, but to dive deeper to ensure that the city is well served. So, I understand we need to move on and so on and so forth. There are lessons to be learned. Those are the kind of areas where I think lessons are to be learned. We really have to change the way contracts are managed. We really have to have confidence that that has been done and not simply have a reassurance that it's been done. And we have to look at how these decisions are made. It's a burden not just for council elected members who are then served up to the public as the people responsible for a decision. It's also, I imagine, a burden for council officers who are put in a situation where they're making decisions that are going to have major impact on the city. So I think, personally, I still think an independent look at this and the lessons we could learn from best practice elsewhere would help us move forwards.
Okay, I'm hoping we're starting to draw to a close. I just have one last question in terms of the timeline around the exchange of letters. So it says, mainly because there's a sort of variation in the description. So it says in a letter to the leader, is that a physical letter posted? In paragraph 16. There said a response was sent. Was that also a physical letter or an email? Because
the letter we've seen is an electronic document. We don't know how that arrived.
Okay. Just trying to understand this technical issue. is the technical issue that Royal Mail just took a long time to deliver it, or was it that it was lost in the ether somewhere? Thinking if we're sort of conducting business by letters with Royal Mail, it might, that might be a learning point to not do that.
Chair, if I may, the letter that we've seen, I've got in front of me, is an electronic version. I infer from that it arrived to us electronically rather than it was scanned, but because we weren't the recipients of it, it was passed on by the leader's office. Can't say 100%, but I would say letters are unusual, and lots of time you can tell by an electronic signature. This one doesn't have an electronic signature. Well, it looks like an electronic signature, so I think it's electronic. So I don't think it's a Royal Mail issue. I think it's a lost in the ether issue.
That's right.
All right, to clarify the same question, please, on 19, that we sent a letter on the 25th of September. Can you tell if that one was digital?
Again, it has what appears to be a digital rather than an ink signature on it.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand if we were dealing enough with the Royal Mail to know sometimes things disappear. Okay. Are there any? That's a Rose?
Yeah, my only other main kind of question was around that 19. So, I mean, we're trying to avoid talking about individuals, but someone receiving an email at 4 p.m. on the final working day of the month and being able to reply within the end of the same working day, I think is pretty impressive in the circumstances, and the timing around the 25th through to the 2nd is an unfortunate set of timing. But the surrounding that was about the fact that the service was superseded entirely by that point. I just wanted to ask kind of a binary question. This is going to be a kind of feel it out question if you have any sentiment on it, but there was this non-universal but relatively strong community feeling that there was a gap left at that point in time, or that it was unexpected. And I just want to ask that question of, did we need that extra month and we failed to land it, or did we not need that extra month and we were seeking it to try and appease people, or what was the extra month trying to gain? What was it, just sentiment that people felt something had suddenly happened and there was a gap, or had we not done everything we wanted to do in terms of handover at that point?
My understanding is that there was an acknowledgement that there was some tidying up to do. The Salvation Army had asked for 6 months. Clearly, that's expensive. It's an expensive contract, and we were determined to make savings from it by bringing the service in-house. Clearly, the advice of the Director of Finance the previous March was that under no circumstances should this be extended, but the council came to a position where it could live with a month's extension without. They're constantly thinking about procurement risk and challenge around this. So it was if you like, a small amount of time that they felt that they could give, as I understand it, to tie up those loose ends.
I guess
but it was already too late in essence.
It's sort of a balancing of risk. There's a risk of extending financially, and the fact that the service was kind of already, but also there's a risk of not extending in the fact that it wasn't fully finished and so on. So it's kind of both. You have to try and find the middle ground, and that month was preferred from a risk perspective, but wasn't necessary.
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. I think that finishes off our questions for clarification. I think we could move on then to looking a bit more about the lessons learned and what recommendations we would like to take forward as a committee. I don't know if anybody would like to make a start. I think Councillor Rose, you mentioned you've got a list. Do you want to...
Yeah, I've got 8. Maybe other people want to share theirs, and I can pick the ones that aren't covered.
But if you go through yours, I'm sure if anybody else.
Okay, happy to. I think the first, I guess, recommendation is the procurement rules for when a decision needs to be made on bringing something in-house or terminating the contract or extending the contract fully or via waiver or going out to a tender process. It would be good to have someone or ourselves look at what the rules codified today are around that procurement decision, the timing of it, whether it's sufficient. I don't think it is like an electricity contract. If it's like an electricity contract that I have to renew 6 months before the end of it, and that when there's no electricity afterwards and it takes me 6 months to replace it, or I just do my own electricity at home, I think it's a very different world to that. And I think that's not to diminish the comparison made at that point in time, but that level of rigor in that re-procurement thing, I think, is a big, tangible, meaty thing that should be looked at by somebody, if not us.
Keep going.
Second one, we had the waiver reasons. Apparently the waiver reasons for extension were clear, but they weren't publicly visible. I just wonder whether the reasons for the waiver, even though the waiver, the contract themselves are private, but the reasons we're extending something for 6 months, it feels like that probably should be recorded in an accessible manner for the public potentially. So it might be worth having a look at what's in those historically and whether they could be made public. Third one was mentioned about regular service reviews. Certainly in my experience of loads of contracts is anything, of a reasonable size of contract, you'd expect a quarterly or monthly service review about that. There should have been touch points throughout this process, whatever those look like, business reviews or just quality of service, KPI stuff. So it'd be good to look at whether we got a rule around that in our contracts to ensure they're in there when they're notable, either size or in terms of criticality to vulnerable people. There was the question around the kind of gaps in the contracts, and the specific one was around the extension to service and whether that was clearly written and whether we have some wording that we should ensure is in there to clarify what that extension looks like and when it can no longer be extended. It sounds like there was a little bit of ambiguity in the minds of some officers around or some members around whether you could extend beyond that September. So it'd be good to make sure we've got clarity on consistent wording on that. Transitioning services from one supplier to another generally seems sound. You have that offboarding period from one to another. It doesn't sound like there's the same level of rigor applied here when the transition is from a third party into the council providing that service. And I wonder whether that needs a little bit of a look at as well from migrating ownership when the migration is too internal from external. We had the point already made around members potentially having an additional log of where they feel like there's a reason to ask somebody else to make a decision for them, even if there isn't a conflict of interest, not just exec, but broadly as well. I've put on here as a note, we were just talking in the Constitution Working Group today about independent persons and then validating stuff. And maybe there's a situation here where an independent person can just go, yes, that seems reasonable. And there's clarity on who owns that decision after that point or something along those lines. Communication channels, there's a whole thing around who's actually owning it. You've got the contract owners, and should it not matter who the exec is and who the director is, because the contract owner is actually the gateway into the whole of the council and they own all the comms. And also if someone's on leave, does their out of office actually appropriately cover who people should go to if they can't get through to them? That whole thing around if there's ambiguity of who's in charge or if someone's unavailable, how do we ensure communication is still clear for critical things? And then I've also got a final bullet point, which is I've got some concerns about the reports we've had over the last year on this subject. It's not part of the conversation on this agenda, but I do think we should look into the way in which we got to this meeting. And I think we still don't think that this report was written to address the concerns that we had as a committee. And it was a very well-written report, but it doesn't perhaps pick on some of those procurement pieces. And so maybe there's a wider conversation around those reports. But I'm trying to take all of the specific scenario out of all of those kind of recommendations, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Anybody have any further comments? I think as well we've talked about internal audit of contracts more generally, which I think would be useful. Is that something?
Yeah, we can certainly get that in train. It's just another piece of work that they will look at, and they will pick a selection of contracts.
Is it possible for them to use this as a sort of
this can be one of the contracts they look at, so that this is almost the starting point of this is a contract that we think could perhaps have been drafted better, and then we'll look at a selection thereafter so that they can quality assure that actually things have improved over time.
Yeah, and I think it would be useful to use this one, as you can sort of see from the list. It's, sort of brings up a lot of other issues that are useful to think about, and, it's not quite worked, even if it's sort of tangential to, you know, it's not a particularly massive contract, but it sort of helps bring out lots of other issues that might need looking at. And I think that would be...
And contract management as a subject is probably a good topic for internal audit to have a look at.
Is that something we can
put that in? I can put that in train immediately.
Okay. Was there anything else? I'm trying to think if I had anything else. Councillor Vesey.
Thank you. Yeah, I certainly think that we should be looking at the constitutional issues behind here in delegated decision making. I think we look at a lot of other things in the Constitution, but ensuring that key decisions, I know that has a different meaning in other situations, but that decisions that have strategic risk to the city, that it should be possible to identify those and ensure that we don't get to the situation that we've rehearsed here of an executive member being unable to participate and therefore the decision is just taken by officers. I think we need to think more seriously about that, to look at how we can protect not only residents but the reputation of the city and a whole load of other things, so that there's clarity and we don't end up with things being delegated without proper engagement and understanding of the democratic consequences of that. So I think if we could put that on the task list.
It's obviously something that would be coming to the Constitution Working Group anyway. More than happy to bring that up the list. I think certainly on a personal level, I think our scheme of delegation is not very well drafted.
Yeah, no, that's my feeling too. And there's an area here that we haven't discussed, and I'm not obsessed with discussing it here and now, but I want to note that it was there, that reference is made to the whole legal thing and letters being drafted and then not being issued. I can quite understand that one might not want to rehearse what that was in a public meeting. But again, from the point of view of ensuring that audit and governance can have confidence about process, I think clarity is needed there. You know, was there a conflict of interest? Where did it come from? These issues, it may have nothing to do with conflicts of interest, but I think as elected members, simply taking it on the nod that that's okay and it's all resolved, given how serious this situation has been, concerns me. And I still think we should be looking at, in a sense you've referred to it, Councillor Rose, about how independent persons are involved. I personally still think that an independent audit is called for here for everyone's sake. And I take on board the points that were made earlier about it shouldn't just be spending money on the Salvation Army contract. The point of these independent audits is to then learn lessons that can be applied to everything else. And plainly, if it's just focused on one contract, that's a lot of money and resource to look at one issue. But I think we would benefit from having an outside person or organisation auditor looking at this in the round and helping us understand how we might improve things.
And if I may, internal audit are independent to us. Whilst we have an internal audit service, they have their own independent professional accreditations that they have to adhere to. And what that means is I cannot interfere in an internal audit investigation. I can't say to them, you're not going to find that because I don't like it. So they are utterly independent in that sense. You know, and they are a service that I can, as I say, I can commission this, whether it be tomorrow or Monday. I can ask them to add this to their work list, and they can prioritise it as necessary.
I personally, Chair, I'm not that exercised as to whether it's done in that process or someone from a different process, but I think that an independent audit of one form or another, it's time for something like that to happen to resolve this.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense in terms of process, and that doesn't preclude something later on should they raise something that would be worth further investigation. So
and ultimately, if they find that there's a fundamental problem somewhere, they are duty bound to raise that to you as the committee, as well as to me and to Pauline and to Debbie and various others. If that then requires us to speak to external audit or to commission some external work to fix that, that's absolutely the next step of the process if it's required.
I've got Miles Money and then Jolie.
Thanks. Just on scheme of delegation, just recognising sort of I'm an independent member here, but just to chip in, we have to have them, and lower level sort of financial, whether you do that by financial threshold or whatever, it has to be in place. And Bryn, if you say that it could be tightened, then great. But I think it's unsustainable to ask an authority to identify any decision anywhere within the authority, which are independent institutions, to identify any decision that could be made, of which there'll be 1,000 every day across however many members of staff there are here, which has a degree of reputational risk. Because anything which gets media or political attention has reputational risk. You need the scheme of delegation because there'll be 1,000 decisions. I'm a civil servant with some degree of local government responsibility. Ministers have to delegate things to us, because otherwise we'll be going to, Angela Rayner 2,000 times a day. I just wanted to sort of set out that view that if you could tighten it, great, but reputational risk things will hit, and I don't think it's members' role, councillors' role, to make decisions about anything which could have a reputational risk, to be honest.
I think from my perspective, I would look to amend the scheme of delegation so that it's more appropriate. I have seen schemes of delegations in many different forms, going from, I suppose the broadest was all decisions are delegated to directors unless they are explicitly reserved to an elected member. So as a director, you had absolute autonomy and authority across your directorate, unless there was a specific sort of upward delegation to members. That's the broadest I've seen. Very easy to operate under as an officer, because I'm a director, I've got that power, thank you very much. There are, I don't know how many authorities there are in the country, about 600, something like that. I suspect there'll be 600 different schemes of delegation, but I'm happy to bring it to the Constitution Working Group and we can have a proper conversation about it.
Just a related point about things being passed back to other people. I'm not used to an audit committee anywhere meeting without either the finance director or the audit activity being represented. If they had been here, they would have heard this and they'd have been in a better position to respond to this when they're asked to do something. So if, I don't know within the governance you've decided whether your principal advisor, part of the regular governance, is the internal auditor or it's the finance director, but neither of them are represented at the moment. And a lot of the issues that you address are related to their areas of responsibility. And certainly some of the stuff that's gone round and round the houses here related to their areas of responsibility.
The advantage, of course, Chair, is the meeting is recorded, so we can at least get them to watch it.
I think one of our auditors was watching via whatever, Zoom or YouTube or something, but yeah. Trying to remember Councillor Rose. Okay. Just go back to point 2, which Councillor Rose raised on the waiver reasons being recorded and accessible. Is that possible? Is it worth it? Something that'd be worth coming to this committee as a report every now and then?
What we could potentially do is look at bringing an exempt item to the committee so that you can see key waiver details. But it's something I'd need to take away and have a look at first, just to make sure that there's not going to be any issues with doing that. So if you want to record an action that I can guarantee we can do, is that the Director of Governance will go away and examine that issue and bring an update back to you.
Okay. Were there any concerns with any of the other?
I mean, in essence, a lot of what you're talking about in the recommendations are about how contracts are drafted. and how contracts are, the assurance that you need that contracts are being put in the right format. I think probably what you need is the internal audit report, which tells you that that's the case, rather than a recommendation that they should be drafted in a certain way, because inevitably contracts will be an evolving beast. And you know, the contracts that we draft in 10 years' time will be completely different to the ones that we have now. So I think some of it is about how we make sure that the recommendations are met in the appropriate way. I'm not seeking to change them, but it's just how we tie them off properly.
Well, perhaps if we could have a conversation offline with Chair, Vice Chair, and I'm sure we can include whoever else would like to, just in terms of how we address some of those and how they're then represented, I guess, in the minutes and action plan.
Yeah.
That's probably the
more than happy to do that. Yeah.
Councillor Merritt?
Yeah, just responding to what Bryn said, it's not just about the contracts, it's about the management as well. And I think the one point that's not picked up in your three sort of areas in paragraph 30 is the training, the training aspect, which I think was acknowledged. It also needs tackling.
Keep going. And that will have to happen not only because we expect to do internal training anyway, but also because of the changes in procurement legislation. So I know that there's going to be a much more significant piece of work done anyway, but certainly recording that that's the case would not go amiss.
And just so members are aware, that is on the corporate scrutiny management forward programme that we have a report on the procurement issues. So it is on the agenda. It's not years down the road.
Thank you. If there's no further, Councillor Rose.
Yeah, one very quick point on the contract that from a background where I've helped write £100 million plus contracts, I'm actually not convinced there are any problems with the contract drafting. I haven't seen any evidence there's a problem with the way the contracts are written personally. It's the procurement process and the deciding to bring it in-house, etc., that I had more of a concern about. I just wanted to make one separate point. We've talked about it a lot recently around the political engagement and the way that we work across teams, and we're talking about the potential reputational impact as well. And I just want to say I think a non-zero amount of that came from the fact that there was a lot of rhetoric thrown around in public. And I've got in front of me a quote that said the service shouldn't have been under threat in the first place. Labour's cancelling of the Salvation Army support, and it was made by someone who was a member of exec when this decision was made, and it wasn't correct. And I think trying not to politicise the conversation, I think the way it's blown up and the way it was talked about and handled was as large a problem as the actual handling of the contract itself. I know we've got that on the table, and I don't want to politicise this, and I don't want it to blow up either, but we do need to have this conversation about how we work better cross-party and stick to factual accuracy when we're doing things like this and quotes and everything else as well, because I think that's been as bad as everything else related to this. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I think the point's made. I'm sure I could also pull out some quotes, particularly from the Labour Finance executive member, calling the, continuation of the contract unlawful, things like that, which has also been shown to not be the case. So I'm sure we can both play that sort of game, but I think the point is well made that, on issues like this, we shouldn't be seeking to politicise it, but equally, we're a council of two different parties that have two different and, often diametrically opposed views of things. We're going to disagree. That's not a bad thing. The public of York get to decide who wins. At the moment, it's Labour. You get to choose. That's the way it goes. But we're all happy then. Yep, we move on. So we've got item 5, which is I'm assuming this will be. Oh, sorry, and just say to Francis and Paul, thank you very much for coming. And I hope it doesn't feel too much like we've been shooting the messenger for 2 hours, but I think your contribution is very much appreciated and efforts too. So thank you. And yeah, sorry, I'm assuming that item 5 will be relatively swift because I don't think we're working
It
through.
will be extraordinarily brief, if I may, Chair. I am not anticipating that members will want to discuss it at this meeting. The point of this was to give members early sight of what is to be discussed at September's meeting. So you've had plenty of time to look at the details and make sure that you understand where the working group has got to. So I'm not expecting a discussion tonight. I'm expecting that members can see, okay, that's where we've got to. We've now got some time to take it away, think about it on our own, think about it with our groups, and then come back in September and hopefully we can get to an end point.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions or issues to raise? Councillor Merrick.
Does that stop us asking factual questions at this point? Which I've got a couple, if that's all right. Page 27, paragraph 4.2 deals with the issue of the Lord Mayor not being a councillor, being able to exercise a casting vote. How can that be legal if they are not a councillor? Page 27, paragraph 4.2. Last sentence.
So if the Lord Mayor is no longer a councillor, and obviously we had it in 2023, in the extremely unlikely event that they have to get to a casting vote, and bear in mind that if they're no longer a councillor, you'll have a councillor who will replace them. So we will still have an odd number of councillors. But if we end up with a tie, the council has the ability, obviously, to co-opt members on for the purpose of resolving these sort of issues. Now, I think in practice, the number of times that will happen would be extremely limited. But it's a point that we can certainly look at.
It just feels very, if you're in a situation where there is a tie, presumably it would be on a pretty critical issue. And then you have a person who hasn't been elected making a decision for the whole council. It just does not seem right.
Happy to look at it. So we're happy to take a look at that.
Yeah.
And your second question.
There was I'll pick it up with you after the meeting. There was a piece of wording which I thought it wasn't quite right. It's minor detail.
Okay.
Chair, unless there's anything when this turns up in September, or unless there's anything which turns up in some of the working groups that are feeding into it, I think this is possibly a good time for me to finally have my swan song, as I've been promising that I'd like to go for the last year plus. I originally said I'd only serve here for a year. I'd make 2 final digs back, which are based on other documentation you've seen. If you look at some of the stuff that Mark Edgill said to previous iterations of the audit committee, most of you weren't even on the audit committee at the time, he repeats the local government association's mantra about us, which is behaviour and culture, cultural issues, things about the way in which councillors work together, not about the officers, but about councillors. Councillor Rose has just mentioned it as being an issue, and it really is a key issue for you, that you be able to talk to one another, swear at one another, do whatever you want to do outside the meetings. But at meetings, if you keep politicising non-political, structural, factual issues, you're in trouble. And if you keep lowering the reputation of the council outside of meetings, the council's in trouble, the community's in trouble. And I'm not saying that you end up being lapdogs and yes men, none of you are. And I actually have a lot of time for you as individuals. And I've said that a million times. I wouldn't be willing to give the time up you give up to do these jobs. But sometimes it's really difficult for the community. And those public interest reports and the follow-up from them, and I hate to add it, but actually in a sense, some of the stuff which may be hidden behind the thing we just spent 2 hours on may reflect some governance issues as well. But anyway, if nothing else is to which I can significantly contribute is required in the next few months, I think this is a good time to say thank you. And thank you for all the fishes the preachers once said.
Yes, and no, I'm sure on behalf of the committee and properly minuted our thanks for your service over the past year, and you know, thank you very much. We've not quite finished, so we've still got the work plan to look at. Are there any issues with the work plan? Are we happy to, Councillor Rose?
It's sad, I'm sorry, but the update on the constitution review isn't in the September meeting work plan. I know we've said it's coming to September. I know it is coming to September. It's not on that work plan, just mentioning it.
Okay. There's no further issues. I've got no urgent business, so I'm happy to close the meeting there. Thank you. Thank you.
I think this one's permissible. We should have